Howdy, friends, and welcome to the Alt Country Show. I'm Emily Smith, and we've got an incredible guest on the show today, an artist that I first played on the Alt Country Show close to 8 years ago with music from their self-titled album. They've been doing a lot since then, including their most recent album, Real and Fantasy, which has a pretty interesting backstory for how it came to be. And I think this episode will give artists and music fans a glimpse into a path where you can make money in the industry that is not often discussed, but given the proper parameters, can both create income and make beautiful art. Our guest today is Ariel Bui, a bit of a wanderer, but currently based in Nashville with dreams of moving out west. Before we get into the chat, I want to encourage you to follow the Alt Country Show wherever you can, but especially want you to find us on YouTube. We're going to be sharing a lot more great content there, including videos from the Alt Country Showcase. All of our podcasts can be found there, and our Music Plus Talk episodes will now be exclusively on YouTube because Spotify is doing away with that feature, unfortunately, and that starts in just a couple weeks. So YouTube is the spot where you'll get most of our content in one place. We can still be found on all the other podcast platforms, but all of our content can be found on YouTube. You should follow us on social media as well. We've got a lot of exciting things coming up. We're really ramping up the output over here. TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, come find the Alt Country Show. This week alone, we're dropping 2 more interview episodes and an incredible music video featuring Nicky Diamonds that you won't want to miss. I thank you guys for your support. And now Ariel will chat with Brandon Telg. Brandon is an artist manager for the artist Johanna Warren, the label head at Spirit House Records and 4-Bits Records, amongst a million other things that he does to help the music community. Please enjoy this conversation with Ariel Bui and our guest host, Brandon Telg, and I'll see you back here later this week for my own conversation with Nicky Diamonds.
All right. Hello. My name is Brandon Telg, and I am once again here on the Alt Country Show podcast. I am taking over hosting duties for Emily Smith, who is your, as you know, normal host. And I am very, very excited about our interview today. And this is with Ariel Bui. Ariel is from Nashville and is a very seasoned, well-established singer-songwriter, artist, musician, and whose music I have followed for quite some time. My connection to her music and to her artistry is interesting and kind of winding, and I think we'll get into it as we talk. But we're here today in particular to talk about her most recent album, Real and Fantasy, which is out now on all streaming platforms. So, first of all, thank you for taking some of your day to talk with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Brandon. I really appreciate it.
So, your music is a blend of different genres. I hear what sounds like inspiration from your Southern roots as well as straight ahead rock. I've heard that you have a classical background as well. This may sound super basic of me to ask, but I'm not a musician. That's like just straight up something I'll tell you right now. How do you navigate the challenge of like melding all of these diverse influences into what to me is a cohesive sound?
I mean, honestly, as a person who listens to different kinds of music, I find it difficult to stick with one genre. So it feels more natural to me that all of the different kinds of influences that come in would come out cohesively. All that to say, there are many kinds of music that I listen to that don't directly come out in my music. I love dub reggae, for example, or like more electronic experimental stuff. I mean, pop stuff still, but like the knife and things. And I don't think necessarily all of the or hip hop, early hip hop or R&B. I don't know if those necessarily come out in my sound. I think that's more a challenge of my instrumentation, though, than my musical genre melding style, if that makes sense. As a solo artist, I write on the guitar. So that's kind of been one of the gateways into the different types of styles that do come through in my music. For example, with acoustic guitar, folk, and then with electric, rock and roll. And, I started on a classical guitar, trying to play Andres Segovia and stuff. So with the instrumentation of the guitar, it becomes, I guess, just natural and easy for me to, take all the styles that I like to play and that it becomes something. Also, I find that a lot of genres can become formulaic. And so one thing that I do like to do is kind of put a little bit of a twist on, what might otherwise be pretty straightforward, whether it's a lyrical twist, whether it's kind of like taking it to a minor key. But also I love artists that kind of seem to straddle genre as well. I mean, Beyonce's new record, for example, but not just her new record, like her past ones too, where even Renaissance, the last one, I mean, there's just so many different vibes throughout the different songs. And I think that that's really cool. Or, Elliott Smith kind of bridging that gap between kind of folk solo and rock and roll and punk. And, Angel Olsen also kind of like bridging that retro 60s 70s folk meets rock and roll scene, right? So and of course, being from the South and living in Nashville and being a writer of sad songs, country music speaks to me. Old country music speaks to me in that way too. So I don't know, it's something that's easier for me to do, to be genre fluid, if you will, than to not.
Well, thank you. And, this conversation is about you, but since you invoked the name of Queen Bee, and because I think that the new album, Cowboy Carter, has a lot of overlap with the idea of the alt country show, I'm curious, as you live in Nashville, what is the reception of this album out there? And again, only really discussing it because it is a kind of pop culture moment to be talking about the limits of country music, but you live in the home of country in Nashville. And side note, if there are any weird noises, my dog decided to start making noises now as soon as I'm recording an interview. It's not me. That's what I'm trying to say. When I hear Cowboy Carter, I think of a really interesting, like what it is. What it is to me is an interesting experiment in what the limits of country music are and what they can be. But I'm curious what the reception is on that album. In your stomping grounds over in Nashville?
Honestly, I'm very much of a homebody, but I do teach piano and run a music school. And so I have kiddos and adults that come through my home studio. And a lot of the kids these days are fans of Taylor Swift, for example. And we were just talking about the new record a little bit. And the second song is Blackbird by the Beatles. And I think it's interesting. First of all, I think that a lot of her interpretation of country music involves adding an acoustic guitar or a banjo to something, and it makes it country music. It's kind of like what modern day country music to me is kind of like pop music. But if you add a pedal slide, then it makes it country. So, for example, I would not have thought of Blackbird by the Beatles as a country song, but the kids these days, they're like, oh, that Beyonce song. Like, oh, okay, well, I feel like in the future at some point I need to do a Beyonce cover. Well, I do some at home in the privacy of my own home, but that one and be like, okay, I'm going to do a Beyonce song now, and then play the Beatles' Blackbird. No, but in terms of how Nashville receives, I can't speak for Beyonce's new record, but I can say that the country music awards, the first time that Beyonce played, what was it, Daddy Issues or something on at the award show, how that was very not well received. And the Americana Awards has also had to face a reckoning. Same with the Grammys, that whole hashtag Grammy so white thing, where they have really been confronted with the fact that they need to be more diverse and equitable. I mean, I've lived here for over a decade here in Nashville, and I finally went to the Country Music Hall of Fame for the first time because I had family from out of town in town. That's, how it is when you finally see the touristy things in your own city when other people are there doing touristy things. And it was so clear to me in this Country Music Hall of Fame, you're looking at all these instruments like the banjo, like the early versions of, like the banjo and a lot of other instruments that came from Africa that were brought over essentially. And if you go for, not as far back, then there's Christian gospel music. But at the beginning of what we call country music now was a lot of different genres. You had this kind of influence of African American music and gospel, these kind of Little Richard rock and roll things. And so even at the museum itself, you see all of these artists are doing very similar things at the same time. And these record labels decided to call what the white people were playing country and hillbilly. And then the exact same music that was being played by African American artists is called race music. So it becomes segregated. So as far as, and we do have the National Museum of African American Music in Nashville now, and you get to see, kind of what feels like giving credit where credit is due. But my cousin, who I was going through the Country Music Hall of Fame with, he said it was interesting that there was this baseline of like Black people were there the whole time, but we're not going to really fully talk about that part of it. And then beyond that, the fact that there's a whole separate museum, he kind of made the joke, separate but not equal. So it kind of does give that feel where like this music came from many groups of people and yet became segregated immediately. The way that it was marketed, it was either hillbilly music or race music, depending on the race of the person who made it, and that's the same with country music, right? It's like when it comes to commercial music, especially, it's almost like, well, if there are white people doing it, that's the default with anything, whether it's in politics or anything. You have a congressman, a congresswoman, a country artist. But then if you have somebody of a different race doing the same exact thing, it's a Black congressman, it's a Black congresswoman, it's a Black country artist. Or in my case, an Asian American, not country, not quite Americana, not quite rock and roll, somewhere in there, right? And it is, it can be a really segregated space. It clearly still is, because there are way more people out there doing it than what maybe the major labels are showing. But in terms of like, say, for example, Black country music, there is the Black Opry. And as far as Asian Americans, someone I know here, Ben Park is what their stage name was, runs this organization called Shoes Off Nashville. And they have a bunch of Asian American people who are country artists, as well as kind of on that pop folk, and some Asian American artists doing like R&B kind of style stuff too. So I guess when it comes to genre, I think that's the thing I like the most about, say, for example, what Beyonce is doing right now. as a lover of country music, I don't know how straight up country I feel like her interpretation of country is, but I'm more of like an old school purist in that way. That's just my own personal take. But what I do appreciate is that, yeah, what does it mean to be country? What does it mean to be from the South? I mean, she's got like hip hop songs in there and, kind of more like folky ballad type of stuff and more poppy stuff. And let's just say, for example, country music is kind of doing all of those things anyway, the hip hop, the the whatever. Like country music itself has been doing this weird, like, let's do a crossover with rock and roll. Let's do a crossover with Nelly. Let's do a crossover with whoever. So like, I think in general, having genres is like kind of a confining thing, which once again, as we're referencing Beyonce, she has been, there's even like a sample in there talking about how genres can just feel so confining. And that's exactly how I've always felt.
I appreciate all of this insight. I figured discussing that album in particular would take us down some interesting roads. And that to me is what is most interesting about Cowboy Carter as a whole, right? I've listened to it a couple times at this point. And is it the world's greatest country album? No. Is it even a country album itself? That's up for debate. It has elements of country. Some songs on there are more country than others. There's obviously it's being billed as a country album. And to me, what is most interesting about it is the like you were implying, the blending of different genres. Because even though, again, to my particular personal tastes and how I understand genre to be, is it a country album? I don't know. But at the same time, it is country in the mainstream sense, right? You and I both know tons of country artists that do very experimental things, and the limits of country have been explored in the artsy circles, for the indie circles, for years and years. But that is not true of country radio, right? Mainstream, popular, capital C country music, right? And Beyonce comes into that space with a sound that is, in my opinion, light years away from anything else really on the radio in the country space. So to me, what's most interesting about it is taking that mainstream country sound and pushing it in a lot of different directions all at once. And Beyonce being who she is, and the instrumentalists that she pulled in, and the references to older moments, musicians, songwriters, etc. It has already and will instigate a conversation around all of these factors, everything that you said, and more. Like, I think dissertations are going to be written on this album as part of Beyonce's larger body of work, but this album in particular, and pulling all the threads, again, whether or not it's a great country album, that it doesn't even matter at some level, because it's starting all of these conversations. And to be clear, I don't want the Hive to come after me. I like the album. I'm not saying it's not good. I'm just saying that there's so much conversation to be had as a piece of work, and all of the things that it represents and all the things that it means. So thank you so much for guiding us through what is going to be part of the musical conversation this entire year, without a doubt. You know what I mean? Like, without a doubt. But to point it back to you, we've talked about Beyonce enough, which is not what I thought we were going to talk about going into this conversation. So you mentioned a lot of different influences and different experimental influences, which I think is worth bringing in how you and I have gotten to know each other over the last couple of years. You and I technically met years ago at a house show here in Gainesville. A friend of mine hosted it, and I took my little daughter. She was much younger then than she is now. And she just loved your music. We bought your LP, And I would play it every night because it's very chill as lullaby music in my daughter's room. That record was listened to many, many times. And then fast forward, I was at Big Ears Music Festival and you just appeared in the place that we were staying, me and my Gainesville crew. And I was like, why in the world do I recognize her? And then we threaded the needle that my friend whose house show you were performing at, plus one of the people that I was staying with at Big Ears were involved with the radio station that you worked at in Orlando years ago at the same time. Now, did I know that either of these two people that I knew, house show host or the person I was staying with, knew each other, let alone a third party in you? No, but I just thought it was so cool that all of these circles came together. But the reason why I bring all that up is that Big Ears is like the music festival in the United States for experimental, avant-garde, forward-pushing art music. And you and I had, although we went to a lot of different things, we're both equally in that space of like, let's push our limits of what music looks like, what music means. And I am curious, all this to say, where some of those big earsy type of influences might influence what it is that you're doing, or is it just like I'm a fan of this music and I want to see it? Like for you, where does all that lie?
Honestly, I learned about Big Ears Fest from, that friend that you were staying with who, yes, college radio, WPRK for life. And but Big Ears Festival is something that kind of, I always ended up accidentally kind of going to a little bit. One year I had a friend who had a spare press pass, and that was the first year that I went. And then I think the year that I saw you, the night before, I saw Layla McCalla at the National Museum of African American Music performing some pieces that she had done where she set the poems of Langston Hughes to music. And she had an accompaniment of an experimental chamber music group here called Chatterbird. And so I saw it and I was so inspired by it. The way that she also incorporated Haitian language and Haitian music into her music. And then, taking these poems by Langston Hughes and incorporating it into this cool way of melding her roots on many levels with her own sound. And as a Vietnamese American artist, I've always been trying to figure out, how do I incorporate my roots into my sound? And it's interesting to see her, have to explore that. It's like, she didn't grow up necessarily knowing how to speak a lot of Haitian Creole. And I didn't grow up like knowing how to speak Vietnamese very well, like a childlike version of that. So anyway, I struck up a conversation with her and she was like, I'm playing at Big Ears tomorrow. Do you want a free day pass? So the year that I ran into you, I had a last minute day pass that turned into finding out that our mutual friend was there and crashing with you guys instead of driving back to Nashville from Knoxville. So that was that year. And then last year I attended on an artist scholarship. And what I think is really cool about a festival like Big Ears Festival is that it is specifically non-genre specific. When I say experimental, I'm really careful with that because some people are very experimental and some people are really avant-garde. So I feel like my music is way more straightforward than a lot of that avant-garde experimental stuff. I'm not like, here's 4.5 minutes of silence, but it's never silent kind of avant-garde experimental. I'm more like, hey, guess what? All the styles and genres are like interrelated and can somehow be made cohesive in an easy to digest pop way. I find the more avant-garde stuff to be very like intellectually stimulating, but perhaps more cerebral than the container of. And when I say pop music, I say that from the lens of classical music too. Almost, I mean, basically anything that's not classical music is considered pop music, whether it's blues or country or rock and roll or anything, all of it's pop, right? Something you can put together in a 3-minute thing and have some verse, a chorus, a bridge, maybe, and have it be really like easy to listen to. I prefer the easy to listen to route, but I always appreciate artists who are subtly experimental, like the Radioheads of the world, or like the Beatles or something, where it's easily digestible pop music. Or like I've been doing a bunch of Elliott Smith covers lately, and they're always like easier than they sound more simple than they are, or vice versa. They're a lot more simple than they sound. But either way, it's kind of this like, it's like a Trojan horse of like musical depth in something that is lighthearted. So anyway, once again, we're kind of just talking about genre. And I appreciate the space of Big Ears Festival because they'll have anywhere from that super avant-garde, cerebral stuff to just straight up like pop artists, and everywhere in between, whether it's singer-songwriter or electronic or rock and roll or kind of more like international. I do wish they had more Asian American led artists, as a space that is so diverse, not only in musical genre, but in like representation of different people from all over the world, whether it's like Japanese artists or African artists, and there are like band members of other leads that are Asian American, but I would love to see just like in any, I would just love to see more discussions about representation, Asian American representation, for example, outside of the kind of black and white conversations. I think that it's really powerful and important. African American representation is extremely important, but there are just so many minority groups that are kind of left out of these bigger conversations about race and representation oftentimes. And so that is something that I would love to see more in general, whether it's Americana Fest, whether it's the Grammys. Like I never have seen a televised Asian American person on the Grammys. That's not to say some Asian American people haven't won them, but they're usually not televised. And, just stuff like that, where I just really hope for the music industry to become more diverse in terms of genre, but also more diverse in terms of different people of color.
I genuinely appreciate that. And to your point that somehow I keep landing us in this conversation around genre, that wasn't necessarily my intention, but is absolutely, I think, where the line of questioning that I wanted to talk with you about sort of does actually fall. Because when I was starting to identify some questions to ask you, it is a bit more challenging to identify a framework for your work, because there are so many different sounds, right? Like some of your earlier material stuff that I listened to a lot with my daughter is definitely more in the country or singer-songwriter, folkier kind of veins, right? But then again, your new album, Real and Fantasy, some of it sounds more like 60s rock, right? Some of it sounds more like vibrations between what I call head music, heart music, and body music, right? Some of it gets you moving, some of it gets you thinking, some of it gets you feeling. And I guess for me, as not a music journalist either, right? Identifying the thread is a bit harder to do because as a music listener, I'm like, I just love it all. But I'm wondering if there is a thread to the time and place of recording Real and Fantasy that influenced some of the sound or sounds that I am picking up on here. I know that you recorded this album at the Bomb Shelter in Nashville. Did recording there influence the shape, the sound, the the album as a whole?
Well, I mean, Real and Fantasy was recorded at the Bomb Shelter as well as the record before that, which was my self-titled LP. And so the first record, I mean, I've made records before that, but the self-titled record that I recorded at the Bomb Shelter in about 2015 or so, that was a lot more folk and country, but it had a rock and roll song on it as well. And then by the time I recorded Real and Fantasy, this is a very behind the scenes like music industry reference, but I was commissioned essentially to write a female alt indie rock record. So I met with an A&R rep who came to Nashville. I met him through another Florida mutual friend. And he said, hey, there's this sync licensing company, basically a music library company, a label, looking for Nashville singer-songwriters to add to their roster at Audio Network. And I said, hey, I would love to get into sync licensing. I think that that's where a lot of the good music in indie, whatever, all the good indie music is on TV nowadays. And I know that sounds very not highbrow, but MTV turned into reality TV with cool music in the background. And then it just turned into reality TV. And so now it's like cool bands like Battles have their songs in the back of, cyber truck commercials or whatever. And also we were talking about representation in music. I thought, well, maybe it'll be easier for me if my face, which is not white, is not front and center as the brand. It's really the music behind the shows and the movies and stuff like that. So when I got the opportunity to sit down with this A&R rep, they asked me, are you a country and Western writer? And I said, well, I have written country and Western songs, but I would not consider myself a country and Western artist. I've written rock and roll songs. I mean, when I was living in New Mexico, I had like 11-minute stretched out meditative jam songs that were like desert, time and space have a different existence kind of vibe. And then, my first record was kind of more of a folk meets classical, like the Sad Girl album. So at the end of that conversation, the A&R rep told me, oh, so you're a concept artist. And I loved that. I was like, I will take that because A, it didn't make me feel confined to a genre. And B, it made me feel like, yeah, because I think a lot of the times I get concepts in my mind. With the self-titled record that is heavily different styles of folk, country, a little bit of blues, that was my concept record of, hey, I'm from the South. I was born in Louisiana. I live in Tennessee. Florida and Texas, they're their own weird kinds of South, but I've also lived in those places. And so I am a Southern girl. And Nashville, I didn't know the word Americana yet. It had a vibe, a musical language that was kind of folky with a little country, with a tiny bit of blues and a hair of jazz and and some rock and roll. And that was my concept. That was my Cowboy Carter. It was like, I am from the South. I can, but some of it wasn't pop country. It was like, ooh, what about you know, what about when the cowboys go off and there's so many cowboy rambling songs from the point of view of the cowboy? You know, what's it like to be the girl who's getting ghosted from the cowboy or whatever, you know? So my newer record, they had originally asked, "Are you a country and western writer?" But they found a song on my self-titled record called Appraisal, which is set to a poem by Sarah Teasdale, written at the turn of the century. But I set it to a kind of like Beatles rock and roll-esque vibe. And they said, "Can you write some more songs like that?" And that was challenging, but that was the concept then. The concept became, and of course, everything I do with as much genuine and honest storytelling as possible. But the concept of the real and fantasy record is it is a female alt rock record. And I was like, well, what does that mean? There's so much alt rock. I mean, even just within that, what does that mean? There's like country rock, there's like 60s rock, there's so many women, in rock. There's like Fiona Apple, but then there's like, Deerhoof and Blonde Redhead, and then there's, Angel Olsen, or, but that's just like, if we're only naming some women, and then, there's like so much rock in general. So I was really wanting to do like a surf rock record. But I will say, when it comes to the interpretation of genre, a lot of it has to do with how it's produced. So the song itself is like the skeleton. One person that I really appreciate what she's done with a lot of her songs, for example, is Bjork. I didn't really get into Bjork originally from her main songs. It was this box set that some ex-boyfriend got for me when I was 16 or whatever, that it was a box set of like different settings of her songs. And it was like experimental string settings of her songs. And then it was like beat heavy versions of her songs. And then it was like the original pop versions of them that came out. And I still think that that's so inspiring. I would love to hear my songs in different genre settings and in different, it's easy when you're just the setting of a solo acoustic guitar to make it sound like a folk song, right? But you could just as easily turn that folk song into a country song, into a rock and roll song, into a classical song. I mean, it's how you then do the instrumentation and how you adjust the tempo and what tone do you give the production of it that really calls that. And so honestly, it almost feels like it gets taken out of my hands sometimes in the studio when all these other layers get added. And I'm like, I don't know if I would have chosen an epic solo like that. I was writing this song at 2 a.m. Like with my electric guitar unplugged in my room, like it always just like transforms. But I would love to see my songs transformed in different genres and different settings with different instrumentations. The way I kind of envisioned the songs on this album were to be way more stripped down. I kind of had a little bit more of like an early Angel Olsen in my mind. But then some of the songs became straight up like 80s dance songs, or like, like one song that got turned into a country song, I heard it more as a folk punk song, So like it totally also changes just based on the instrumentation and stuff that gets added afterwards. But like, to answer your question, I don't think that necessarily recording at the bomb shelter is what made it rock and roll, even though the bomb shelter is rock and roll, just because I did the last record there too, and it was way more Americana. But I love the bomb shelter because it is an analog studio, and Andrea is a really talented producer who does listen to a lot of different kinds of music and is sick of that straight up, very, very straightforward country Nashville thing. So going there allows me to have something that's got a vintage feel that is unique and modern.
Well, I am super fascinated by the idea that, and like you said, it's kind of inside baseball, music industry stuff, that the album was inspired slash commissioned from very, you know, industry business conversations. Because when I listen to it, and this speaks to you as an artist and a songwriter, that's not what I hear, right? Like I have heard plenty of music that sounds like it came out of, you know, business conversations. But that's not what I hear in real and fantasy. And in fact, I wanted to ask you about a couple of the songs on this album. One of my favorite songs is more of it's not one of the singles, if I recall. It is a little more of a deeper album cut, but it's Working Out the Kinks. And since I'm interviewing you, I want to know, what is the story behind that particular song, if there is one to be shared in this kind of space.
Sure. Well, going back to one of the things that you said is like the industry part of it. In that same conversation, when they were like, well, can you, what do you consider your genre? And they were like, you're a concept artist, maybe. I made it really clear that no matter what I do, it's really important to me to have my artistic vision honored, and that I get to be my genuine and authentic self. You know, that was important to me to point out, that I'm not like necessarily, I mean, I would love the challenge too, but like writing jingles for TV shows, for example, right? Like I am an artist and I want to be able to have my freedom of artistic expression. And then going to the story behind Working Out the Kinks. So essentially, the same time that I was connected to Audio Network, it was through this group of friends of the Florida music scene, the Brevard County music scene that I grew up in middle school and high school, just house shows and like strip mall church places and American Legion halls and stuff, all these punk rockers and stuff. So I was kind of like thrown back to those days in my mind. And then I was also coming to terms with being ethically non-monogamous, so polyamorous or what have you. And so I was going through a situation at a time where it was kind of like, that line between friends and like slightly more than friends, or like not even friends with benefits, I wouldn't even call it, but just like, let's just say a friend, right? Because that's the whole hard part too. When you get outside of the norm, the hetero, cis, normative, monogamous vocabulary, there's immensely more vocabulary. And actually, that's kind of where, so a lot of the record is kind of like, that was what was happening in my life at the time. And I thought that was great because I'm in a, what is it they call it? Like mostly monogamous anyway, but relationship with my long-term partner. And I find it's hard to write songs out of that because a lot of my past was writing these unrequited situations. So this friend situationship, let's call it, was like happening at this time, which gave me a lot more juice to write, right? Because it's harder to write about something that's pretty stable and not that dramatic, unless you really want to hear the ins and outs of like, I told you should make an appointment to go to the doctor, but you don't listen to me, or whatever. Like you, I don't know.
Maybe I know what you mean when you follow a songwriter for their whole life, right? And they're starting to get into the talking about their kids phase. And same with comedians, right? Like the material may be relatable in a different way, but it's probably not what drew you to them early on.
Right. They're like a little less a little less tortured and a little more comfortable. So yeah, this situation was happening, and I just was thinking about like the wordplay of like working out the kinks in a relationship, like on many layers, like just trying to work through all these things, like when you're dating or whatever. Like, once again, none of these words apply to this situation, but when you're like trying to figure stuff out with somebody and you're getting to know them on a deeper level, and you find that there's these things that you got to work out, like, oh, you have this personality quirk that I didn't know about before, or like I have this one, and like we're working that out. But also on a more adult level, you start seeing like people in their more intimate like desires, wants, and needs, and like figuring it out if like they are compatible between said people involved. And so I thought it was like a cute song about, always trying to make it a pop song, right? Like a rock pop song, and like waiting by the phone or whatever. Like, in my mind, of course, when you say waiting by the phone, I mean, for me as a kid who grew up in the 80s and 90s, I'm literally visualizing somebody waiting next to their actual landline telephone, but we know we're next to our phones all the time, waiting for that text, waiting for that call with this person, or you're just scrolling mindlessly forever, which does make its way into the album as well, because all the songs were written in 2019 except for one, which was written after in 2020. It's like all these pre-pandemic songs about some friend, right? And then like it goes into like, how do I even write about some dumb songs about boys or whatever after everything hit the fan? But yeah, it's kind of a little bit about that. But honestly, I will say that like the process of writing the songs for this record, normally I'm a lot harder on my songs before I decide that they're done and before I decide that they're good enough to go on a record. I usually will like take a song and play it out live for a lot of times before I decide whether I keep it or scrap it, if I change it or not. And this record, it was just like, okay, I just got into this zone of writing a song once every couple of days, or at least trying to, and then sending the voice memo over to the A&R rep and being like, what do you think? And you'd be like, that's great. So it was kind of like it happened in a different process than it normally does. Like a lot of the songs that I thought were kind of lame, like maybe Working Out the Kinks, made it on the record because, honestly, the criticism of an artist, like my self-critiquing, like is high. And so if a song comes out really easily, which sometimes it does, then you're like, well, that was too easy. It's too simple. It's too basic, or something like that, But when somebody is immediately there to be like, no, it's cool. It's awesome. Let's do that. I'm like, all right, cool. I guess none of the songs got scrapped and all of them got kept. There is one funny part about that song, if I can remember it now. It was like, I forget now exactly what it was, but I did have to change one word though, because it was like, it made it sound like I needed to pee. It was like there was one word where it was like waiting by the phone, wondering when I can get you alone. Oh yeah. It was something like, can I take a peek, or something like that. It was like, I was trying to figure out how to like incorporate like sexting or something into this song. And it was like, but it ended up just sounding like, can I take a pee, instead of like, can I take a peek? So that is a behind the
that's some real behind the songwriter, behind the scene. That's the stuff that they're never going to tell you. That's something you'll never hear Taylor Swift or Beyonce mention when they're writing their song.
I know it's a song about kinks or whatever, but no, thank you on the peeing
it's
thing.
So interesting to hear you describe that song. Really interesting hearing about the way in which language doesn't really work as soon as you step outside of typical sort of structures around society and around relationships. But it's so interesting to hear you describe that song. It sounds almost like some kind of like bubblegum, like 60s girl group type of a song, which I think goes back to what you were saying about how you can produce a song in many different ways. And hearing you say it, I'm like, there is a reading of this song that is done in that style, right? Or could be. But to me, I hear it and it's sexy. It's like got that desire, that longing piece, both in the lyrics, the like waiting, the working things out, but then also the instrumentation, some of the like heavier guitar, like bits, parts. So it's so fascinating to me to hear your description of it versus my hearing and interpretation of it, and how that wasn't quite what I thought you were going to say. Um, but I have one other song I wanted to ask you about, and that's sort of the big single from the album, which was 16. It has a pretty intense story. Can you share it? What does it mean to you to have shared that story in a song? And in particular as a single, not just as a song, but like as the single of the album.
With that song, it was the first song that I wrote for the record. So, you know, I usually write at night. I'm a night owl, but like I'm an in night owl rather than a night, like an out night owl. I haven't been going out very much. I'm like turn into a pumpkin at 8 in terms of being out. And then I go home and then I stay up until 5 in the morning sometimes. And so my partner was sleeping in the other room and I went into the kitchen with my unplugged electric guitar. And I guess what I was thinking about, because remember, concept album. So what all the things that were swirling around in my head were what were the TV shows and movies that I was watching at the time, right? So a lot of like dystopian kind of feminist strong shows like Handmaid's Tale or like Game of Thrones or like these kinds of kind of more heavy stuff. But then I was also watching like a lighthearted teen high school romantic dramedies, like To All the Boys I Ever Loved. There's a lot more Asian representation happening in TV these days, I'm noticing, which is cool. So I was like watching Pen 15 and yeah, To All the Boys I Ever Loved. And there's this other one with the South Asian lead. And so there's a lot of kind of like woke stuff happening, a lot of female empowerment kind of stuff happening, a lot of Me Too stuff, a lot of Time's Up stuff. And so I was kind of like channeling all of that alongside thinking about, a kind of simple rhythm in terms of a guitar thing. So once again, Angel Olsen, I really love her, especially early stuff where it's kind of really simple guitar intro, or like guitar parts that then can have like cool instrumentation around them. And about, these friends that introduced me to this A&R rep. So like these people who were there when I started writing music and performing it at the age of 15 and 16 years old. And then thinking about kind of like what I was saying before, like I like to turn these tropes around, like the trope of the cowboy who's like always just wandering. Like, well, what about the lady who's left behind? What about from her perspective? So in this instance, it was like, there's that Beatles song, which I'm sure was probably not original and probably written by an African American person, but she was just 17. You know what I mean? And there's so many old rock and roll songs about teenage girls. That's just one of them, but there's a lot of songs about, like that really cute 16-year-old or whatever, the really like the heartbreaker teenage girls. So I decided to turn it around and talk about being a 16-year-old girl, and that was me like riding around in the back of some friend's car listening to punk rock music and then picking up a guitar and having to like carve my way into a boys club of musicians to be respected as a musician myself. And then, also navigating the world as a teenage girl involves a lot of predatory behavior, I mean, I have a lot of different instances of sexual assault in my life. Some of them that happened before I was 16, in the context of not the rock and roll scene, but more in the context of the people that you think that you can, trust, which is like family. And then when it came to navigating the rock and roll scene as a teenage girl, there were like, let's just say the drummer of a ska-core band with predatory behavior, and I wasn't the only person. And just like stuff like that, where I'm sure that any female in any music scene anywhere, can share some unfortunate stories of how uncomfortable, at least, and traumatizing at worst, it can be, and once again, kind of talking about how Hollywood has been doing a really good job, I feel like, of doing more representation of Asian representation, for example, or like the people standing up for the Me Too movement. A lot of that stuff's coming out of Hollywood. And I still feel like the music industry is really quiet about the harms to women that have kind of been intertwined in the industry for a while. But that was kind of like, I remember after I, did the voice memo and I sent it to the A&R rep and I sent it to my friend Linwood, who just came out with a new record under the name Mama Zoo. Him and the my friend formerly known as Jessie Zazu of Those Darlings, they just came out with a record. But Linwood, he helped me make the demos to submit to Audio Network of these songs to land this deal. So that was one of the songs. And I remember him saying, that's too heavy. He's like, that song's too heavy for sync. And I remember the A&R rep being like, oh, it's fine. It's cool. It's great. And it ended up being the single. The single kind of reveals itself after the fact. But it's funny that the first thing that came out and that, some people thought would have been too heavy it worked out just fine. I mean, I think there's a way to talk about heavy things in a way that can be lightened. I think we were talking about country music earlier, and this is the alt country show. The reason why I've always gravitated towards country music, even though I love rock and roll and all these other things, is once again, I love the dichotomy of this is why I like some of the early Beatles stuff, although I like their later stuff too. This kind of juxtaposition of sad subject matter with upbeat and poppy music. That's all of country music, right? For example, this is why I think I accidentally, but then ended up in Nashville. Because everywhere I'd go, people would be like, oh, you should cheer up some, quit writing such sad songs. And then I was like, Nashville is like built on sad songs, but you just put it in a major key and you put a drum beat behind it or something. And all of a sudden it's pop, right? So a country music is like sad songs with like an upbeat like setting around it, or like early Beatles songs, they're like sad songs with an upbeat poppy rock arrangement around it. And I feel like it's like, what is it? With a spoonful of sugar, like helps the medicine go down.
Makes the medicine go down. Yeah. I to be honest, what you're describing is why I fell in love with country music eventually, right? So I grew up with an understanding of country being what was on the radio, which is not, I think, representative of what country music often can be most of the time, right? Sometimes radio songs will cut through the noise in a beautiful way, but more than most genres, I think what country radio has become is extremely packaged, extremely specific, and not for me. But as soon as you dig even just a little bit deeper than that, it's sad, it's beautiful, it's all the emotions and joy and longing and I am glad that I didn't let my musical biases, keep me from exploring so many facets of wonderful music. Nothing bothers me more than when I talk to someone about music and they say, "Oh, I love all music except for," usually it's except for country, and sometimes it's also rap. And I'm like, okay, you don't like country music. Is it that you don't like country music on the radio? Because there's so much more to it than that. And it just tells me everything that I need to know, that this person probably hasn't dug very deeply into what's out there. But my final question for you is, looking ahead, what are some of your aspirations for what comes next? You've mentioned New Mexico. I know you've got some projects out there. You mentioned your studio, Melodia,
Yes,
Melodia,
Studio.
and potentially other recordings. What is it that you're working on these days?
Right now, I'm working on recovering from burnout. um, putting out a record, even with support as an independent artist, is an immense amount of work. I know that you do many things in the music industry, and I've really appreciated you lending an ear and as I've just navigated the immense amount of work it is to do all of the different aspects an artist is expected to do these days outside of writing songs and singing them and recording them and having to be your own social media person and management and distribution and navigating an industry that has almost no regulation, no standards of pay, no, like all of that. All that to say, I've been really stoked to have this situation with Audio Network, this record with Real and Fantasy, getting sync placements in television and film, and it's getting, which is super cool. I'm seeing, they call it mailbox money. I'm seeing some royalties coming in, which is super cool. Nothing yet that I'm gonna quit my day job, but it is really exciting to see something that was a fantasy become real, but dreams becoming reality is a lot of work and it's a lot of reality checks. And I also have a lot of passions. So on top of having music that is multiple genres, I also find it really difficult to only do one thing in my life, So I teach music, I run a business that is also a lot of work. And then I am passionate about different causes. So throughout my life, I've done different activism, whether it was Food Not Bombs or, community radio or arts education programming at various nonprofits, rock camps and things like that. Right now, I'm doing a more let's just say a passion project for sustainability. Before I moved to Nashville, I lived in Taos, New Mexico. And I moved out there shortly after graduating from Rollins College in Florida with a degree in music. But I ended up going down this sustainability path, learning how to build and educating others about this form of architecture called earthship biotecture. They are self-sustainable buildings built with recycled materials that passively heat and cool themselves, that catch their own water and treat their own sewage and sometimes grow their own food, and are solar powered or wind powered. And I started building one in New Mexico. So that is another huge undertaking. What's harder than building a record is building a house from scratch in the middle of the desert. But I have been working on that and, working through the Arts and Business Council of Nashville to get fiscal sponsorship to make scholarships for music lessons. So juggling all of those things all at the same time is a lot. Right now, I am just working on taking it easy and enjoying music again, just for the sake of enjoying it. A lot of times in between records, I learn a lot of covers. It's kind of what I like to do. I like to play music, and there's no pressure in learning someone else's song. I mean, only the pressure of like, I want to get it as close as possible, or like, I want to learn how to do this, but that I find like I don't do it necessarily to perform or to record, or anything like that. I just really enjoy playing covers. So I've been just playing covers and trying to separate out the creative process from the industrial part of it, just so that I can get back into it again, and probably most likely will make another record with Audio Network, most likely, since it was so cool to have, the support of somebody paying for the most expensive parts that I don't have to pay them back, and then make the royalties back, but also because it's something that I think is really cool, like the idea of my art being blended with other art, right? And I know House Hunters International, for example, might not be seen as high art, but I watch it because I've also been dreaming about maybe, and I'll put this out there into the universe, today is an eclipse and, new beginnings, and plant the seeds of what you'd like next. I kind of would like to get out of Nashville, and I've been thinking about it for a while. I love it, but it's just the Southern GOP is getting overreached, voters' rights, women's rights, trans rights are all just constantly under attack. And I just visited LA and I just really loved it. There were so many Asian people and Asian food, and the diversity and the people and the music, and all of that was really intriguing to me. So I would love to see if I could make it work. Heading west, go split my time between my desert artist retreat off the grid, and maybe start setting some roots in like a bigger city. Audio Network's based out of LA. Well, their US office outside of London. And I have all these music friends there, and the weather's great. There's an ocean, and it's California, it's like a different country. Or maybe explore living in a different country, where artists are supported and appreciated and there's less guns everywhere.
Well, you know what the other part of the country is, and that's Western. So going out west would only be in keeping with one of the genres that you love, right? And I want to thank you so much for giving us so much of your time today. I learned a lot, and I know that our listeners did as well. And with that, I'm signing off, and I don't really know what the right call sign would be, so I'm just going to give it a yeehaw.
Well, as Brandon said, yeehaw! Thank y'all for tuning in to the Alt Country Show today. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ariel Bui. I hope you learned a lot about the industry side of music, about representation, and about the artists themselves. As I mentioned at the top of the show, Spotify is doing away with their Music Plus Talk programming. So the best place to find us now is on YouTube for all of our content, or you can hit up our website, altcountryshow.com, and be sure to follow us on social media as well. We'll be keeping an eye on Ariel Bui and upcoming releases, and you're not going to want to miss it. I'm Emily. I'll see y'all back here next time.